If you wanted to measure the temperature outside today, you wouldn't grab a wooden yardstick, right?
No, probably not the best tool for the job.
Right. And if you were trying to measure the incredibly complex, high-speed, multi-lane traffic of the modern internet, like the literal flow of human attention across billions of nodes, you wouldn't try to do it using a 19th century glass thermometer.
No, you'd be entirely lost.
Exactly. The tool is simply the wrong kind of instrument for the reality we actually live in. You'd just be, standing there staring at a little line of mercury in a glass tube while a million autonomous vehicles blow right past you at the speed of light.
It's a very comforting habit, though, to hold on to a familiar tool, especially one that has worked for a very long time.
Oh, for sure.
But when the fundamental physical properties of the environment change, using that old tool doesn't just give you an inaccurate reading, it leaves you completely blind to the actual mechanics of the system you're trying to understand.
And that fundamental glaring mismatch between the tools we have and the digital reality we are, actually living in is exactly what we are going to explore today. So, welcome to this special deep dive. We are taking a microscope to a topic that touches every single digital interaction you have, every scroll, every click, every single moment you spend online.
It really is everywhere.
It is. So, welcome to this deep dive into institutional design for the AI age.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a subject that requires a complete paradigm shift. I mean, we have been systematically misunderstanding the nature of digital spaces because we've been forcing old paradigms onto completely new architectures.
Let's lay out the central paradox here right at the start because it is just massive. Think about the platforms you use every day. Meta, Google, TikTok, Amazon. We are talking about engines that generate billions of time-stamped, highly granular behavioral data points every single day.
Trillions, even, if you count the microinteractions.
Trillions. We have never, in the entirety of human history, had more raw data about how human beings behave collectively. Yet, classical institutional theory, which is the specific academic discipline designed to explain how collective behavior stabilizes into routines and structures, is utterly incapable of measuring its own core concepts using this ocean of data.
It's completely stuck.
It's as if we finally built the James Webb Space Telescope, pointed it at the universe, and the astronomers suddenly realized their star maps were written in a language that doesn't actually describe the physical sky.
That paradox is the exact starting point for a truly groundbreaking piece of source material we are unpacking today. Is Vladimir Dachkov's recent paper on defining institutions and why modern data demands a new empirical theory.
Yeah.
What Dachkov methodically demonstrates is that we are in the grip of a profound measurement crisis. The classical frameworks we've used in economics, sociology, political science for decades, they aren't just slightly outdated, they are structurally incompatible with modern data.
They just don't fit together anymore.
Right. So the goal today is basically intellectual demolition and reconstruction. We're going to look at why the old framework collapses under its own weight, and then we're going to look at the blueprints for a completely new empirical foundation.
Which is so needed. Because I can imagine someone listening to this on their commute right now thinking, okay, institutional theory, academic papers, this sounds a bit like an ivory tower debate. Why does this matter to my life? But this is where the urgency of our current moment, here in 2026, really comes into focus.
The urgency is entirely practical. I mean, just look at the headlines over the past year.
Yeah, it's a mess.
Massive platform accountability lawsuits are stalled in the courts. Sweeping AI regulations are caught in endless bureaucratic loops. The highly anticipated algorithmic audits that were supposed to hold tech giants accountable.
Completely stuck in the mud.
Exactly. And the underlying reason for this gridlock is not just political lobbying or a lack of funding, though those exist. It's an epistemological void.
A void in how we even define things.
Yes. Regulators, policymakers, judges, they literally lack the operational definitions to describe what these platforms are doing. They are bringing that 19th century glass thermometer into a federal courtroom to try and regulate a supercomputing cluster.
Which is wild when you picture it like that.
You cannot successfully regulate an institution if you cannot operationally define and mathematically measure what that institution actually is.
So you can't write a law that says, make the algorithm fair or prevent algorithmic manipulation if nobody in the room can point to a reliable measurement of how that algorithm actually governs human behavior in the first place. You're just legislating ghosts.
That's exactly it. You're chasing phantoms.
Which means to figure out how to solve this massive societal blind spot, we need to understand the ghosts we've been chasing, right? We need to look at the classical theories that have been haunting the social sciences.
It requires a bit of historical forensic work. We really have to dissect the old definitions to see exactly where the fatal flaws lie.
Okay, let's grab the scalpel. Where do we start?
So, in classical institutional theory, two major schools of thought have essentially monopolized the conversation for the last 30-plus years. The first, and certainly the most famous in economic circles, is Douglas North's concept of institutions as the rules of the game.
Ah, yes, the rules of the game. Even if you haven't read his original work, you've absorbed it. It's like the water we swim in when we talk about society.
It really is the foundational text of modern institutional economics. North defined institutions as the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction.
Right.
He created this very elegant dichotomy, basically saying institutions are the rules of the game and organizations are the players on the field. It's a beautiful, highly intuitive metaphor.
It is.
It encompasses formal constraints, like the U.S. Constitution or a speed limit, and informal constraints, like a cultural tradition or a taboo against cutting in line at the grocery store.
It makes perfect sense when you're thinking about physical life. You sit down to play chess, there are rules about how the knight moves. You live in a society, there are rules about paying taxes.
But when you actually try to measure this scientifically, the metaphor falls apart. Dyachtkov's paper leans heavily on a brilliant analysis by a scholar named Krull to expose the hidden flaw here.
Yeah, what's the flaw?
North's entire rules of the game concept rests on a massive, unproven game theoretic assumption. It assumes that human actors actually know the rules, that they process them cognitively and actively adjust their behavior based on that knowledge.
Oh, I see.
It treats the rule as a mental construct, an incentive structure consciously guiding choice.
Okay, let me pause there. Because if the rule is just a mental construct, how on earth does a researcher measure it? I mean, you can't put a functional MRI machine on an entire society and see the rules of the game glowing in their frontal lobes.
You absolutely cannot.
Right. If I am following a social rule completely subconsciously, or if I don't even know the rule exists but my behavior aligns with it anyway, how does an economist measure that constraint?
That is the exact identification problem that has plagued the field for decades. They can't measure it directly. If an institution is a constraint that exists primarily in the unobservable mind of the actor, it defies empirical capture.
So what do they do instead?
Well, the theorist ends up looking at an outcome, say, a stable pattern of trade in a medieval market, or a consistent voting pattern in a modern democracy, and simply assumes a mental rule must exist to cause that outcome.
So they're just guessing.
The entire scientific apparatus ends up resting on inference and guesswork rather than actual observation.
So North gave us a great metaphor but a terrible measurement tool. But he wasn't the only one trying to solve this, right? There was another major framework that tried to expand beyond just rules and incentives.
Yes, the sociological approach, most notably championed by W. Richard Scott. Scott developed a framework built on what he called the 3 pillars of institutions.
Okay, 3 pillars. Walk us through them.
The first is the regulative pillar, which aligns closely with North, formal rules, laws, policing, and sanctions. The second is the normative pillar, which deals with shared expectations, moral obligations, and values.
Okay, so laws on one pillar, societal values on the second. What's the third?
The third is the cultural cognitive pillar. And this is where things get incredibly abstract.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. This pillar refers to shared frames of meaning, mental models, and taken-for-granted assumptions.
Taken for granted assumptions.
Right. Scott was trying to capture a very real phenomenon that North missed, which is that a massive portion of human behavior isn't governed by conscious calculation of incentives.
We're not always playing 4D chess.
Exactly. It's governed by background assumptions that make certain actions seem entirely natural or obvious, to the point where we don't even realize we are making a choice.
It's the classic elevator scenario, right?
Perfect example, yes.
Yeah, you walk into an elevator, you press the button, and you immediately turn around to face the doors. There is no penal code written on the elevator wall mandating you face the door. There's no fine if you decide to stand facing the back wall, making direct eye contact with everyone else.
That would be deeply uncomfortable.
Right. But you don't do it. There's this deeply embedded, taken-for-granted assumption of how human bodies orient themselves in that specific spatial geometry.
That is a flawless illustration of the cultural cognitive pillar. But let's apply the scientific lens to your elevator example. How do you, as a researcher, operationally define and mathematically measure that taken-for-granted assumption? You can describe the behavior after you witness it. You can count the number of people facing the door. But you cannot measure the cultural cognitive assumption itself because it is invisible. It's a phantom.
And I imagine researchers haven't just ignored this problem for 30 years. They must have tried to build better ghost hunting equipment.
Oh, they have tried repeatedly. And the literature is basically a graveyard of these attempts. Back in 2007, Aoki tried to redefine institutions fundamentally as shared beliefs.
Okay.
Then you had Wake and Valgenbach attempting to use incredibly complex latent variable modeling to try and capture these cognitive constructs. And just recently, Hendricks proposed a massive unified framework, attempting to bridge the gap between individual cognition and collective rules.
Did any of it work?
As Deichkoff argues so effectively, no. All of these attempts ultimately fail because they don't solve the core problem of unobservability, they just relocate it. They're all still desperately trying to measure invisible phenomena inside the human skull.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the structural problem here. If these researchers cannot actually see the rule, and they can't empirically measure the shared belief or the cultural cognitive assumption, how do they prove to their peers that the institution even exists in the first place? What is the actual methodology?
The methodology, when you strip away all the academic jargon, is an unfalsifiable tautology.
Okay, unpack that.
Here's how it works. A theorist observes a stable pattern of behavior. They then infer that an institution, a rule, or a norm must exist to cause that stable behavior. Then they turn around and use that very same inferred institution to explain the behavior they just observed.
Oh, wow. That's like looking out your window, seeing the trees bending, and saying, the trees are moving because the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
And I can scientifically prove the wind is blowing because the trees are moving.
Exactly.
An endless closed loop. You are never actually measuring the wind independent of the trees.
That analogy perfectly captures the conceptual circularity. It fundamentally resists falsification, which, as we know, is the bedrock of the scientific method.
Right.
If institutions are defined as rules, and the existence of rules is inferred purely from the resulting behavior, then institutional theory isn't a hard science. It's an elaborate system of retroactive storytelling.
That is a brutal critique.
It is, but you can see the catastrophic practical consequences of this measurement, dead end, when you look at the tools that global policymakers actually rely on today.
Give me an example of the tools. What are governments and NGOs actually using right now if the theory is this broken?
Look at the massive, highly respected international instruments like the Worldwide Governance Indicators, the WGI, published by the World Bank.
Okay.
Or look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index. These are tools that drive billions of dollars in foreign aid and shape global economic policy.
Right. You hear those cited constantly in international relations,
Yeah.
like country X moved up 3 spots on the governance index.
Exactly. But look under the hood at what they're actually measuring. They aggregate surveys of human perceptions asking business leaders if they feel a country is corrupt. Or they score policy environments by counting how many laws a country has passed.
So they're just counting paper and asking opinions.
Yes. They are measuring policy outputs and subjective human perceptions. They absolutely do not measure the institutions themselves. The entire mediating mechanism, the actual physical and psychological process of how a written law in a parliament translates into a behavioral pattern on the street, or how a social norm becomes a daily routine, remains a completely impenetrable black box.
Oh.
To adapt your analogy, they are measuring the exhaust coming out of the tailpipe, surveying people on how the exhaust smells, and claiming they have scientifically mapped the internal combustion engine.
So classical theory is just staring at a black box, making educated guesses based on the exhaust.
Precisely.
But here's the thing that makes this so fascinating to me. If classical theory is struggling because physical reality is a black box, then digital platforms should be their absolute dream scenario, right? A platform like Meta or Amazon isn't a black box, it's a glass house. We have the data. We don't have to guess if the wind is blowing the trees. We have 1 billion timestamped digital records of every single leaf twitching.
That was the initial optimism, yes. Everyone thought big data would save the theory.
But I'm guessing that when you take this flawed 1990s theoretical lens and point it at the most data-rich environments in human history, it doesn't solve the problem.
It doesn't just fail to solve the problem, it fundamentally shatters the classical framework. Deichkoff identifies this as the ultimate empirical stress test.
A stress test that it fails.
Spectacularly. These digital platforms are environments where behavioral data exists at an unprecedented microsecond granularity. The signals that drive behavior are perfectly identifiable, and institutional patterns, new norms, new routines emerge in a matter of days, not decades.
Everything is accelerated and invisible.
Right. But when we apply North or Scott's theories to these platforms, we uncover three massive fracture points that prove the old theory is dead.
Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. Let's explore these fracture points. What happens when old theory meets new data? What is fracture point 1?
Fracture point 1 is what we can call the A-B testing illusion. Now think about A-B testing. It is the absolute bedrock of digital platform optimization and product design.
Oh, absolutely.
You show variant A of a feature to one group of users, you show variant B to another group, and you see which one performs better. In classical scientific terms, this sounds like a perfect randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, it's the gold standard of the scientific method. Random assignment. It's how we test the efficacy of pharmaceuticals. It's how we test if a new website layout drives more sales. You isolate the variable.
Except on modern digital platforms, the fundamental premise of random assignment has completely collapsed. Diachkov cites a devastating systematic review by researchers Cornell and Hardesty.
What do they find?
They conducted an exhaustive examination of peer-reviewed studies that utilize the native A-B testing environments of Meta and Google. The findings are staggering. Platform A-B tests systematically and aggressively violate the random assignment principle.
Wait, walk me through the mechanics of that. If I'm an advertiser, say I'm running a small business, and I set up a straightforward A/B test on Facebook to see if a red button or blue button gets more clicks, isn't Facebook's system just randomly splitting my target audience down the middle 50-50?
It used to be that simple, but not anymore. That is the illusion. When you feed two variants of an ad into the platform, you aren't just dropping them into a neutral environment, you are handing them over to incredibly aggressive machine learning algorithms.
Okay.
These algorithms actively step in and take over the distribution. They do not randomly allocate. They dynamically select which specific users see which variant based on optimizing for predicted click-through probability, engagement rates, or overall cost efficiency. The algorithm is actively sorting and stereotyping the participants in real time.
Let me make sure I'm getting the sequence right. So I say, test these two randomly, but the algorithm looks at the two buttons, looks at my audience, and says, well, based on 1 trillion data points, I know users who like sports prefer the red button, and users who like cooking prefer the blue button. And since my overarching prime directive from the platform is to maximize total engagement, I'm going to stop testing randomly and just start feeding the red button to sports fans and the blue button to cooks.
Exactly. The platform is not a neutral laboratory workbench. The lab equipment itself is actively interfering with the test subjects to guarantee a specific mathematical outcome.
That is insane.
And the academic literature over the last few years has been documenting this collapse in rigorous detail. Researchers like Goley and his team documented massive interference bias in these algorithmic environments, proving that the foundational statistical assumption of independent treatment effects is systematically violated.
So the data is just corrupted from the start.
Yes. Braun and Schwartz showed how algorithmic targeting completely confounds A/B test results, rendering the measured effects entirely unreliable as indicators of true causal impact. And another team demonstrated that even if a researcher attempts to design the experiment perfectly, non-stationarities in the platform's own back-end metrics introduce unavoidable bias over time.
So bring us back to institutional theory. Why does the death of the A/B test break the classical framework?
It breaks it because classical theory assumes a static environment where rules are introduced and actors react. It assumes the signal, like a new policy or a new button, and the filter, the environment delivering it, are independent variables.
Right.
But on a platform, they are hopelessly entangled. The platform is an active, opaque, self-modifying agent. Neither North's concept of static rules nor Scott's concept of embedded norms can account for a situation where the structural environment itself is a dynamic intelligence that secretly alters the parameters of human interaction millions of times a second.
It's like trying to study the laws of physics. But the room you are in keeps secretly changing the gravitational constant based on where you are looking.
That's a great way to put it.
The environment is alive.
Yeah.
That is a massive fracture point. Okay, so that's fracture point 1,
Yeah.
the collapse of the controlled experiment. Where does the framework break next? What is fracture point 2?
Fracture point 2 is algorithmic exclusion, or what we might call the phenomenon of institutions no one chose.
Institutions no one chose.
Yes. This is where the theoretical failure has profound real-world consequences. The paper highlights a very famous foundational empirical study conducted by Lambrecht and Tucker. They were looking at the delivery of advertisements for STEM careers, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Okay, I think I remember the fallout from this study. They were looking at who was actually seeing these educational ads on social media, right?
Precisely. And what they found was a massive, statistically robust pattern. Women were significantly less likely to be targeted by and shown these STEM education ads compared to men. Now, put on your classical institutional theorist hat. You look at this stable, highly reproducible, gender-differentiated behavioral pattern. It functions exactly like an institution. So what is the rule or the norm causing it?
Well, using the classical framework, I'd have to infer a rule. I'd assume there is a sexist policy written down somewhere at the advertising firm dictating that women shouldn't see tech ads. Or, if it's not a formal rule, I'd assume there's a deeply embedded cultural norm among the advertisers. Or maybe a taken-for-granted assumption that women just don't click on STEM ads, so they manually excluded them.
That is exactly what the old theory demands you look for. But here's the terrifying reality. There was no explicit policy. There was no sexist rule written in a boardroom. It wasn't even a cultural norm at play in the delivery parameters set by the advertiser.
Wait, really?
Really, the advertiser wanted everyone to see the ads. The exclusion happened purely due to the cold, amoral economics of algorithmic optimization.
How does that work?
Well, the context for this is brilliantly unpacked by other researchers looking at machine learning bias. The underlying mechanism had nothing to do with gender ideology and everything to do with pricing.
How does pricing lead to gender exclusion?
On digital ad platforms, attention is priced dynamically based on demand. In general, women control a larger share of household retail spending. Because of this, retail advertisers, clothing, home goods, cosmetics, they bid aggressively for the attention of female users.
Right.
This high demand drives up the cost of displaying an ad to a woman. Women are, simply put, more expensive to target.
Oh, I see where this is going.
The algorithm delivering the STEM ads was given a very simple, blunt prime directive. Maximize the number of clicks while minimizing the cost per click. It was an efficiency engine.
It just wanted cheap clicks.
Yes. The algorithm quickly learned that it could acquire cheap clicks from men, but acquiring clicks from women exhausted the budget too quickly. So, to fulfill its mathematical directive of cost efficiency, the algorithm actively optimized women right out of the informational environment. It built a wall around them.
Let me push back on this because I want to make sure we aren't letting the programmers off the hook. If the algorithm is doing this, and a human engineer wrote the algorithm, isn't the algorithm's code the rule? Doesn't that just fit perfectly into Douglas North's definition? The engineers wrote the code acts as the humanly devised constraint, therefore the code is the rule of the game.
It is deeply tempting to make that leap, but it is a theoretical trap. No, the code is not the rule of the institution. Think about what the code actually says. The code just says, minimize cost per acquisition. The code says absolutely nothing about gender. It says nothing about STEM education. The outcome, the societal reality that women are systematically excluded from seeing lucrative educational opportunities, is a massive societal institution that no human intended, no explicit rule authorized, and no cultural norm prescribed.
That distinction is crucial. The programmers didn't write a rule saying exclude women. They wrote a rule saying save money. The exclusion is an emergent property of the environment.
Exactly. It is a stable, reproducible behavioral outcome that shapes human action. It acts exactly like a classical institution, but it lacks every single required feature that classical theory says an institution must have. There is no shared cognitive belief. There is no mental constraint in the minds of the users. The users don't even know they are being excluded. They just never see the ad.
It's invisible social engineering. An entire demographic is structurally excluded from an economic opportunity by an optimization process that nobody designed to do that. And classical theory looks at this massive societal structure, searches for a rule book, comes up empty, and basically just shrugs. It has no vocabulary for an institution that generates itself without human intent.
Precisely. If a scientific theory cannot accommodate a reality this pervasive without stretching its definitions until they snap, then the definitions themselves are obsolete and have to change.
Which brings us to fracture point 3. Because if the platform is both the laboratory ruining the experiments and the invisible handwriting structural outcomes that nobody chose, we need to fundamentally reevaluate what a digital platform actually is in the context of society.
This is fracture point 3, the platform as architect problem. This is about the total conflation of societal roles. In classical theory, whether you are reading North or Scott, there is an assumed clean separation of layers. The institution sits above the actors.
Right.
The rules of the game are distinct from the players playing the game. The environment is distinct from the action.
We understand this intuitively. The government legislature writes the law. The police force enforces the law. The citizens follow or break the law. The referee blows the whistle. The athletes play the sport. There is a separation of powers and roles.
Digital platforms completely obliterate this separation. Think about the structural position of a platform like Meta or TikTok. It writes the rules through its terms of service and API limitations.
Okay.
It simultaneously enforces those rules globally through algorithmic filtering and auto-sated content moderation. It flawlessly records compliance through ubiquitous behavioral logging. And crucially, it dynamically adjusts those rules in real time via machine learning updates based on how the users are reacting.
So the platform is simultaneously the legislator writing the laws, the police enforcing them, the court judging compliance, the prison executing the sanction, and the laboratory experimenting on the citizens, all at the exact same time, within milliseconds.
Exactly. And the literature on platform governance has been trying to sound the alarm on this for years. Dyatzkov weaves this together brilliantly to show the scale of the theoretical failure. Charlton Gillespie warned us about the politics of platforms, how platforms act as these opaque custodians who shape entire public discourses through hidden editorial decisions embedded in their very architecture.
Because deciding what goes in the trending feed is essentially a regulatory act.
Exactly. Then you have researchers who documented how online communities try to run their own democratic governance experiments. But they showed that these communities are doing it inside an overarching environment where the platform holds all the architectural cards. The community might vote on a rule, but the platform's algorithm determines if anyone actually sees the vote.
That's wild.
Other scholars have advanced the concept that platforms have simply become de facto regulators, usurping the traditional role of the state. And some argue that algorithmic selection itself functions as a primary form of governance, literally constructing our social reality by choosing what information exists to us.
Let me try to visualize this for the listener. Think back to the analogy of playing a board game with your friends. Classical theory assumes you have a cardboard board, you have a rule book, and you play. But the platform as architect is like playing a board game where the board itself is a sentient entity.
I like where this is going.
As you're playing, the board is constantly secretly changing the rules underneath your pieces. It's observing your heart rate, seeing how you react to a new rule, taking notes, and then instantly shifting the board again just to keep you playing the game longer. And classical economists are sitting there trying to analyze the rules of the game by reading a paper rule book that the sentient board set on fire an hour ago.
That is a phenomenal way to conceptualize the absurdity of our current approach. Any scientific framework that treats institutions as stable, external constraints simply cannot account for an environment where the constraints are fluid, opaque, and constantly being experimentally manipulated by the environment itself.
It's just broken.
The classical framework is broken beyond repair. The glass thermometer is shattered.
Okay. We have thoroughly demolished the old house. The A/B tests are illusions, the algorithms are generating institutions no one shows, and the platforms are sentient, self-modifying board games. If we are in this much trouble, if our policymakers are truly flying blind, we urgently need the solution. We need that core proposal preview we promised at the very start of this deep dive. How does Dyatzkov fix this?
The fix requires abandoning the unobservable completely. Dyatzkov's central thesis is a radical, empirical reorientation of the entire field.
Radical how?
Institutions must no longer be defined by latent mental constructs like rules or shared beliefs. We have to stop trying to read minds. Instead, an institution must be formally redefined as an empirically distinguishable, statistically stable cluster of behavioral trajectories identified directly in data.
Statistically stable clusters of behavioral trajectories. That is a dense sentence. Let's unpack it visually. In the paper, Dyatzkov provides this really powerful diagram contrasting the past versus the present. I think translating that visual into audio will help clarify this massive shift.
Let's do it. Imagine the past side of the diagram. This represents the era of no data, the era of classical theory. Picture a physical town square. In the middle of the square stands a person. Hovering around this person, like heady storm clouds, are all these abstract, disconnected concepts: government, court system, cultural norms, legal rules, authority.
And in classical theory, there are arrows pointing down from these clouds to the person in the square. It's a very top-down, oppressive visual. The institution is this giant invisible pressure system, supposedly raining down constraints on the individual to make them behave.
But the crucial flaw is that you cannot actually see the rain. The rain is invisible. The researcher just looks at the person in the square, sees that their clothes are wet, and assumes the invisible cloud must have rained on them. It's entirely inferential.
Okay, so that's the past. The physical town square with the invisible rain. What does the present side of the diagram look like?
The present represents the measurement-enabled era. Forget the physical town square. Picture a digital floor made of screens. It is a continuous, measurable, closed loop of interaction. It starts with a signal. This could be a push notification, an ad loading, a recommended video.
A concrete, time-stamped event.
Yes. That signal passes through a filter, which is the platform's proprietary algorithm. The algorithm decides who gets the signal and how it's presented. This filtered signal creates a stimulus for the user standing on the digital floor.
Okay, following so far. Signal, filter, stimulus.
Now, in response to that stimulus, the massive population of users generates a spectrum of possible responses. Some click, some scroll past, some close the app. The specific response a single user makes is a mathematically logged reaction.
Right, the data point.
As millions of these reactions accumulate over time, they form a visible pattern. And when that pattern achieves a specific threshold of statistical stability, that is the institution.
Wait, signal, filter, stimulus, spectrum, reaction, pattern, stability, institution.
Exactly.
So the institution isn't the invisible cloud hovering above forcing people to act. The institution is the stable pattern of the reactions itself. The behavior is the institution.
You have hit on the exact paradigm shift. And this brings us to the philosophical bedrock of this entire framework, which is fascinating. Dachkov draws heavily from Anatol Rapoport's systems theory work. Rapoport introduced a radical idea to the social sciences called the subjectivism of system identification.
Subjectivism. That sounds like the opposite of empirical science.
It sounds counterintuitive, but it is the key to rigorous measurement. Rapoport argued that systems and therefore institutions are not real objective physical entities just sitting out in nature waiting to be discovered by a scientist. An institution is not a new species of beetle that you find under a rock.
Then what is it? If it's not a real thing waiting to be discovered, what are we measuring?
Let's use an analogy. Look up at the night sky. The stars are physically real, they exist. But a constellation like the Big Dipper is not a real object.
Right.
The Big Dipper is a pattern carved out of the data points of the stars by the human observer based on a specific cultural lens. Rapoport argued that institutions are like constellations. They are carved out of the raw behavioral data by the analyst based on specific, transparent mathematical criteria. The researcher actively decides what threshold of stability defines the cluster.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here because I can hear the classical economists screaming. If the analyst is just carving this institution out of the data however they see fit and deciding what the threshold is, doesn't that make the whole thing incredibly subjective? Doesn't it make it arbitrary? A researcher could just say, hey, I found an institution because I manipulated my parameters until one appeared.
That is the standard critique, but Rapoport's brilliance is showing that this explicit subjectivism is actually science's greatest strength. It is not arbitrary. It is ruthlessly honest. Think back to the classical theorists. When W. Richard Scott said, I have identified a taken-for-granted cultural assumption, that was a deeply subjective, arbitrary judgment, but he disguised it as an objective scientific discovery. The classical theorists hid their subjective assumptions inside vague, unmeasurable definitions.
Oh, trust me, the invisible cloud is raining.
Exactly. Rapoport's subjectivism forces the analyst to bring their assumptions out into the light. In this new framework, the researcher cannot just vaguely gesture at a norm. They have to explicitly state in their methodology, I'm defining an institution as a behavioral cluster that maintains a 95% stability threshold over a 30-day rolling window using a specific clustering algorithm. That is an explicit mathematical choice.
And because it is explicit, it is falsifiable. Anyone else can take the exact same data set, look at the researcher's stated criteria, say, I think a 95% threshold is too loose, I'm going to run it at 99%, and see if the cluster holds up. It dissolves the tautology entirely because the assumptions are mathematical parameters, not hidden philosophical biases.
The transparency is what makes it a science. It's the difference between saying, this soup is terrible because it violates the cultural norm of what soup should be, versus saying, this soup has 500 milligrams of sodium per ounce, which exceeds my explicitly stated threshold for palatability. One is an ideological argument you can never win. The other is a precise measurement you can endlessly replicate and debate.
Okay, that makes total sense. I am sold on the philosophy, but I'm a practical person. I want to see how this actually works in the wild. How do we build this new science? Because shifting from rules to statistically stable behavioral clusters sounds great in a paper, but I want to see the engine. Let's get into the mechanics of this. How do researchers actually do this?
The paper outlines a massive comprehensive research architecture. It is divided into 3 interconnected tiers. Think of this as the complete step-by-step toolkit for measuring society in the digital age.
Love a good toolkit.
Tier 1 is the base definitions. These are the primitives. We are throwing out the old dictionary of rules and norms and creating a new vocabulary that maps directly, one-to-one, onto the digital trace data that platforms actually generate.
Okay, give us the new dictionary. Walk us through Tier 1.
It starts with the informational signal. This is any objectively recordable change in the digital environment. A time-stamped event, a push notification lighting up your screen, an advertisement loading in your feed, an email hitting your inbox.
It's the digital tap on the shoulder.
Exactly. Second is the reaction. This is a discrete logged action, or critically, a logged inaction in response to the signal. It's a tap, a click, a swipe, a comment. But it's also a half-second pause while scrolling, or a deliberate swipe away to dismiss a notification. Every micro-movement is a reaction.
Which platforms track
Relentlessly. Third, we zoom out to the behavioral trajectory. This is the time-ordered sequence of reactions from a single user. It's the specific, unique path you take through the platform over a session, a week, or a year. It's the breadcrumb trail of your attention.
Like tracking my entire path through Wikipedia when I fall down a rabbit hole at 2 a.m.
Yes. Fourth, we zoom out again to the behavioral spectrum. This represents the full, chaotic, undifferentiated distribution of all reactions to a specific signal across the entire population before we run any analysis on it.
It's the raw noise. Just millions of trajectories tangled together like a massive ball of yarn.
And finally, the fifth primitive, the holy grail, the behavioral cluster. This is what emerges when we apply advanced, unsupervised machine learning to that chaotic ball of yarn. The algorithms untangle the trajectories and group them based on mathematical similarity. When a grouping is stable, that cluster is the institution.
Okay, so Tier 1 is the vocabulary. Signal, reaction, trajectory, spectrum, cluster. But vocabulary doesn't explain why things happen.
What?
Why does my random 2 a.m. Wikipedia trajectory end up looking exactly like 10,000 other people's trajectories? What forces them into a cluster?
That takes us straight to Tier 2. The theoretical scaffold. This is the engine room of the framework. This is where Dijkhoff explains the mechanisms of how these raw pieces interact to form society. He discusses perception filters, how the exact same signal is perceived differently by different demographics based on past algorithmic targeting.
Interesting.
He explores habituation, the neurochemical process, where we learn to unconsciously ignore banner ads but instantly click on red notification badges.
The platform trains us.
It does. Dijkhoff also brings in classic economic theory, but updates it, specifically Oliver Williamson's work on opportunism. He argues that users interpret algorithmic signals through a hierarchy of self-interest and cognitive load minimization. We take the path of least resistance designed by the platform.
That makes sense.
But the most crucial part of Tier 2 is the mechanism of stability. How do individual selfish choices lock into a stable societal cluster?
Right, what is the glue?
The literature actually points to a brilliant concept here. Dijkhoff highlights a theory by a researcher named Trumbull who introduced the concept of market gravity. Trumbull argues that platform metrics like the like button, the share count, or the trending leaderboard don't just measure behavior, they function as measurable architectural gravitational centers.
What does that mean, practically?
Think of a massive platform feature like the TikTok For You page algorithm as a planet the size of Jupiter. Its massive gravitational pull fundamentally warps the space around it. Human behavior, our individual trajectories, are pulled into orbit around these metric centers.
Like satellites.
Yes, the platform designs a feature to reward a certain type of outrageous video with massive visibility. That algorithmic reward is a gravitational well. Content creators, acting in self-interest, fall into orbit, producing that exact type of video. The metric itself generates the stability of the behavior.
That is a stunning visualization. The algorithm creates a gravity well, and our behavioral trajectories just fall into orbit around it. We think we're making free choices,
Right.
but we're just following the curvature of the digital space the platform designed.
Exactly.
Okay. We have the vocabulary in Tier 1. We have the gravitational engine in Tier 2. What is Tier 3?
Tier 3 is the mathematical operationalization. This is the toolkit. We don't just sit around philosophizing about gravity and clusters. We calculate them using hard data science. The paper lists specific, highly advanced statistical tools required to map these institutions.
Okay, I want to understand these tools, but data science can get opaque fast. Let's translate them. What is the first tool?
To identify the clusters out of the chaotic spectrum, researchers use unsupervised trajectory clustering algorithms. The paper specifically cites tools like UMP and HDB scan.
Okay, UMP and HDB scan. How do they work?
Let's push an analogy here. Imagine you are in a pitch-black room, and dumped on the floor are 10 million different Lego pieces. You can't see their colors or what they're supposed to build, but you can feel their shape, and you can feel which pieces click together perfectly.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
UMAP and HDB scan are like a swarm of tiny robots in that dark room. They don't know what a car or a house is. They have no preconceived notions. They just rapidly touch all 10 million pieces, measure how they connect, and start sorting them into distinct piles based purely on mathematical proximity and density.
So they sort the behavioral trajectories into distinct piles without any human bias telling them what to look for.
Exactly. But finding a pile of Legos doesn't mean you found an institution. A random spike in traffic because a celebrity tweeted isn't an institution, it's a fad. So the next tool is stationarity testing. The researcher has to prove the cluster is stable over time. Deichkov cites the augmented Dickey-Fuller test for this.
The augmented Dickey-Fuller test. How do I visualize that?
Imagine you are looking at a boat on the ocean through a telescope. The boat is bobbing up and down on the waves. That's the daily volatility of user data. The Dickey-Fuller test is a mathematical way of checking if that boat is aimlessly drifting with the current or if it's firmly anchored to the ocean floor.
I see.
If the data shows the behavioral cluster is drifting, it's just noise. If the test proves the cluster is anchored and returns to a mean over time, congratulations. You have mathematically proven the existence of a stable institution.
That is incredibly clear.
Yeah.
So we sort the Legos with UMP. We check if the boat is anchored with Dickey-Fuller. Is there a third tool?
Yes. Society isn't static. People change habits. So how do we measure how people move between these anchored institutions? For this, researchers use Markov chains.
Markov chains.
Think of a pond covered in lily pads. Each lily pad is a stable behavioral cluster. You have a frog, a user sitting on one lily pad. A Markov chain is a mathematical model that tracks the frog's jumps. It doesn't care how the frog got to its current pad. It only calculates the probability of which pad the frog will jump to next based on observing millions of previous frog jumps. This allows researchers to mathematically map the intercluster transitions. They can prove how a user goes from a casual reader cluster to an extremist content cluster, step by step.
Okay, I want to see this entire three-tier toolkit in action.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the most disturbing example we talked about earlier, the STEM ad problem. The algorithm optimizing women out of seeing science careers. Apply this new framework to that exact scenario. How does this solve the problem that classical theory couldn't?
It is a beautifully clean clinical process. Step 1, using Tier 1 primitives. We identify the signal. The signal is the STEM education advertisement entering the platform's ecosystem.
Got it.
Step 2, we map the reaction spectrum. We capture the full chaotic distribution of millions of users responding to this ad across the platform, and we retain the demographic metadata.
Okay, gathering the data.
Step 3, we bring in the Tier 3 toolkit. We unleash UMP and HDB scan, our little robots in the dark room, on this raw behavioral data.
And what do the robots find?
Without us ever telling the algorithm to look for gender, the mathematics reveal two distinct, highly dense behavioral groups. Two piles of Legos.
Yeah.
We run the Dickey-Fuller test, and it proves both piles are deeply anchored and stable over time.
Right.
Cluster A is dominated by male users who frequently receive the ad and react to it. Cluster B is dominated by female users whose trajectories show they are systematically bypassed by the ad delivery filter.
And here's the magic trick of this entire paper. We don't need to find a hidden sexist rule to prove the institution exists.
You have nailed it. The statistically stable pattern is the institution. The data proves the outcome is real, anchored, and reproducible. We have successfully measured and identified a massive societal institution, the structural gender distribution of economic and educational information, without ever having to guess what was inside a programmer's head or what taken for granted cultural norm a user was supposedly following. We carve the institution directly out of the raw data.
It completely bypasses the black box. We didn't need to read anyone's mind. We just measured the gravity. It's breathtaking.
It's incredibly powerful.
But I want to bring this back down to earth. We've gone incredibly deep into the theory. We've looked at the math. We've talked about UMP and J.K. Fuller. But this is not just an academic debate about dictionary definitions. This has massive immediate consequences. Think about the apps on your phone right now. Think about the news feed you're going to scroll through later today. This framework changes how those operate. Let's explore the social engineering and the real-world impact, because this is a tool for survival in the AI age.
It absolutely is. Let's start at the macro level. The regulators and the courts. As we mentioned at the very beginning of this deep dive, in 2026, the legal system is essentially paralyzed. Congress holds hearings, regulators drag tech CEOs in, and they constantly ask the same question. Is your algorithm fair? Or did your engineers intend to discriminate against this group?
And the tech CEOs just smile and say, Senator, we don't know. It's a black box neural network. It's just optimizing for engagement based on user preferences. We didn't intend anything. And the hearing ends in a stalemate.
Right. Because fairness and intent are normative classical concepts. They have no operational, measurable answer in a machine learning model. But armed with Deichkoff's framework, the regulator's entire strategy changes. The regulator no longer has to ask about intent, and they don't have to ask about fairness.
What do they ask?
The regulator can subpoena the platform's Tier 1 behavioral trace data and ask a purely empirical mathematical question. What specific behavioral clusters has your platform stabilized, and do those clusters mathematically violate our intended legal policies regarding equal access?
Oh, that is a total game changer. The burden of proof shifts entirely. You don't have to prove the platform meant to discriminate. You don't have to find a smoking gun email. You just run the Dickey-Fuller test on the data.
Exactly.
And if the math shows a statistically anchored cluster of algorithmic exclusion based on race or gender, the platform is strictly liable for the institution it generated, regardless of intent.
Exactly. The defense of "we didn't know" becomes legally irrelevant because the platform built the architecture that generated the gravity well, and we are already seeing proofs of concept for this kind of rigorous measurement in the wild.
Really? Where?
Deichkoff cites a fascinating study by researchers looking at India's UPI ecosystem, which is their massive digital public financial infrastructure.
Right. Billions of transactions a month.
Yes. These researchers didn't just study it qualitatively or survey users about how they felt about it. They used this exact kind of trajectory clustering on the hard transaction data to measure how the platform acted as an institutional equalizer. They mapped the clusters of financial inclusion.
That's amazing.
Another brilliant example is work done on Reddit's Community Notes feature.
I use Community Notes all the time. It's the crowdsourced fact-checking feature.
Right. Researchers showed empirical mathematical evidence of real-time platform policy adjustment. They tracked how the platform dynamically shifted the architectural rules based on user behavior clusters, mapping the Markov chain transitions as users moved from spreading misinformation to being corrected by the community. These aren't just academic theories anymore. This is real-time, measurable institutional engineering being documented in peer-reviewed science.
Let's scale this down to the people actually building these tools.
Yeah.
What does this mean for the product managers, the UX designers, or the software engineers who might be listening to this right now?
It requires a radical, almost terrifying shift in how you view your job description. If you are a product manager at a tech company, you are not just driving engagement. You aren't just tweaking the color of a button to get a 2% lift in daily active users to hit your quarterly OKRs. You are an institutional architect.
You are attempting to build stable behavioral clusters in human populations.
Yes, you are literally building the town square and deciding how gravity works inside of it.
That is a heavy responsibility.
It is. And this framework gives you the mathematical tools to prove if a new feature you shipped actually created a genuine, stable societal institution, an anchored boat, or if it was just a fleeting, transient spike in attention that will vanish tomorrow. It elevates product design to applied sociology.
But with that power comes a massive liability. You aren't just designing software, you are designing society. Which leads to what I think is the heaviest, most consequential realization in this entire paper, the burden of social engineering. Because platforms now bear empirical responsibility for the behavioral spectra they generate.
They do, because they can no longer plead structural ignorance. For the last 2 decades, platforms have used a very effective shield. They argued that they are just neutral conduits, blank slates, or that their algorithms are too complex, too black box to fully understand or control.
We've all heard that excuse.
But Deichkoff's framework destroys that shield. It proved that the exact data required to assess macro-institutional impact is already being relentlessly collected by these platforms every single millisecond.
They already have the Tier 1 primitives. They log the signals, they track the reactions, they store the trajectories. They use UMP and clustering algorithms every day to serve us better ads.
Exactly. As Deshkov points out, connecting this back to Shoshana Zuboff's foundational work on surveillance capitalism, the argument over platform regulation is no longer a moral argument. It is a methodological one.
If you possess the data, and the scientific community now possesses the math to measure the institutions you are creating, you are responsible for the clusters you stabilize. Period.
Yes, the excuse that we just built the algorithm, we don't control the emergent outcome, is now mathematically void. If the institution is defined as the stable behavioral cluster and the platform architects the environment that produces and anchors that cluster, the platform owns the institution. They are the sovereigns of the digital space, and they can finally be measured as such.
Wow. Let's just take a breath. We have covered an incredible amount of ground today. The sheer scale of this intellectual shift, from philosophical guesswork, from trying to measure the wind by staring at the trees, to hard, data-driven, mathematically rigorous institutional science. It is monumental. It feels like moving from alchemy to chemistry.
It is a paradigm shift in the truest sense of the word. We are finally retiring the glass thermometer. We are building diagnostic tools that actually match the scale, speed, and reality of our digital environment.
Let's do a quick recap of the journey we've taken through this framework. We started with the massive paradox. Modern digital platforms produce billions of granular data points, yet classical institutional theory, our best tool for understanding society, broke down because it relied on unobservable mental constructs. It was obsessed with inferring rules and norms that existed only inside people's heads.
Which led to the unfalsifiable tautology.
Right. Then we look at the empirical stress tests, the fracture points where the old theory died. The A/B testing illusion, where platforms actively disrupt their own experiments to maximize engagement. Algorithmic exclusion, the terrifying reality where algorithms create massive societal structures like gender segregation and STEM job ads purely based on cost optimization, without any human rule, intent, or prejudice.
And the platform as architect problem.
Yes, where the platform simultaneously acts as the legislator, police, judge, and sentient board game, changing the rules in real time.
And out of that demolition, we explored the solution, redefining institutions from the ground up, abandoning the search for hidden rules and instead defining institutions empirically as statistically stable behavioral clusters carved directly from the data using Rapoport's subjectivism.
We map the engine. Tier 1, primitive signals, reactions, trajectories. Tier 2, theoretical scaffolds, market gravity pulling us into orbit. And the Tier 3 mathematical toolkits.
Yeah.
The UMP robots sorting the Legos, the Juki-Fuller test checking if the boat is anchored, and Markov chains tracking the frog jumping between lily pads, turning sociology and institutional economics into a precise, empirical, falsifiable science.
A science that finally gives regulators the tools to hold algorithmic architectures accountable for the societies they engineer.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about your own digital footprint today. When you close this audio player, when you open your email, every time you open an app, every time you pause on a video for an extra half second, every time you swipe away a notification, you are not just passively consuming content on a screen. Your micro-actions are forming a behavioral trajectory.
Absolutely.
And somewhere, in a massive server farm, a platform architect's algorithm is tracking that trajectory, sorting it with millions of others, and trying to pull you into a stable orbit. You are actively participating in the real-time mathematical generation of new societal institutions. You are the data point in the cluster.
And that reality brings us to one final lingering thought. It's something that builds directly on Deshkov's Tier 2 concept of signal-to-norm dynamics. Throughout this entire deep dive, we've established that institutions are stable behavioral clusters formed in response to algorithmic signals. But notice one core assumption we've held on to. We're assuming that the user is still making a reaction, a choice, even if it's a subconscious, habituated one in response to a signal.
Right. The platform shows me the red notification badge, and I still have to physically move my thumb to click it. I am still the one generating the reaction.
But the architecture doesn't stop evolving. What happens when platforms fully integrate and leverage predictive generative AI? What happens when the algorithm becomes so sophisticated, so deeply trained on your personal historical trajectory, that it doesn't just measure your reaction anymore? It anticipates and preempts your reaction before you make a conscious choice.
Yeah, what do you mean?
If the platform's filter perfectly predicts your behavior and it tailors the signal so seamlessly to your psychological profile that your reaction is essentially a mathematical guarantee, are we still active participants in society's institutions? Or, when the prediction error drops to zero, have we simply become solved variables in a platform's closed-loop mathematical equation?
If the thermometer doesn't just measure the temperature, but perfectly controls the weather so that it's always exactly 72 degrees,
Yeah.
are you even experiencing the climate anymore?
Right.
Or are you just living in a terrarium? We will leave you to mull over that slightly terrifying but endlessly fascinating idea. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.